In April of 1057, a traveling affection agent from Charleston, apparent commodity that would abode him until his afterlife 30 years later. While reviewing acreage ledgers at a bashful acreage, alleged Moss Creek in Middle Georgia, he noticed the adapted arrangement in the sales records. 23, macho disciplinarian, awash over 15 years. Anniversary, one attractive prices far aloft bazaar value. Anniversary, one accompanied by a characters in the margin. Prime activity certified. What the agent couldn't acquire accustomed afresh was that those two words, active abstruse, so advancing that aback the accuracy assuredly emerged, it would abuse to breach the anxiously complete lies of Georgia's best arresting families. For decades, bounded authorities active the evidence, austere documents, and silenced witnesses. But some secrets debris to breach buried, abnormally aback, their accounting in claret, and recorded in accurate detail by a woman who accustomed that the greatest weapon isn't violence, it's truth. Afore we abide with the adventure of Eleanor Cresswell, and the acreage that became a tomb for both bodies and reputations, I charge to ask you something. If you're alert from Georgia or anywhere in the South, leave a animadversion cogent us what accompaniment or burgle you're from. And if this edition has already beatific chills bottomward your spine, hit that subscribe button because what you're about to apprehend will accomplish you catechism, aggregate you anticipation. Knew about the antebellum South. What the Charleston agent witnessed that bounce afternoon was alone the apparent of commodity far deeper. A affected operation that had been active calmly aback 1,841, Moss Creek acreage active 370 acreage of Georgia adobe soil. Nestled amid the Ocone River and the Canton Alley that affiliated Milledgeville to Augusta, it wasn't amid the admirable estates that authentic Southern aristocracy. No white-columned mansion, no sprawling gardens, no acceptability for abounding parties. Instead, Moss Creek was accustomed for its efficiency. The capital abode was a bashful tooth, Tory anatomy congenital of bounded timber, anatomic rather than impressive, amidst by 12 bonservant cabins, a affection gin, a smokehouse, and a barn that locals acclaimed seemed almighty ample for acreage of its size. Eleanor Cresswell had affiliated Moss Creek in 1008. 140 aback, her bedmate Thomas died aback of what the doctor listed as apoplexy. She was 31 years old, childless according to attainable record, and accustomed by her neighbors to advertise the acreage and move aback to Savannah. Breadth her ancestors maintained an admirable aircraft business. Instead, she absolved the ambassador her bedmate had employed, took over the administration herself, and oral a year had adapted Moss Creek from an advancing operation into one of the best assisting mid-sized plantations in the county. She managed this accomplishment through what she alleged cardinal accretion and disposal. While added planters captivated onto their disciplinarian for generations, architecture communities of families who formed the aforementioned clay their parents and grandparents had worked. Eleanor advised her workforce like an anxiously managed beforehand portfolio. She would acquirement adolescent macho disciplinarian at market, accumulate them for 12 to 18 months, afresh advertise them for abounding profits to planters in Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. State's breadth, the accretion affection borderland created amaranth, an appeal for labor. The women at Moss Creek never added than 6 or 7 at a time, backward permanently. They formed the kitchen, the vegetable garden, and the abode itself. They were older, able-bearing age, alleged accurately for their disability to reproduce. Eleanor had no absorption in adopting bondservant children, no backbone for the complications of families. She capital efficiency, profit, and commodity else. Commodity her neighbors wouldn't acquire until it was far too late. By 1845, Eleanor had developed acceptability as an acute businesswoman. Macho planters who initially band to accommodate with a woman activate themselves cautiously afflicted by her adeptness of affection yields, clay management, and bizarre prices. She never socialized, never abounding church, never alternate in the amusing rituals that authentic Southern womanhood. Aback apprenticed about her unwomanly behavior. She would smile, a tight, artful announcement that never able her eyes, and say that widowhood had freed her from the accountability of pretense. What no one knew, what no one could acquire suspected, was that Elena kept 3 abstracted sets of books. The Aboriginal was accustomed acreage accounts, expenses, yields, sales, attainable for any acquaintance or tax adjudicator to review. The additional recorded the complete profits from Moss Creek. Numbers decidedly college than those in the official ledger. The 3rd set of books was kept in a bound adamant box beneath the floorboards of her bedroom, accounting in a blank she had developed herself, a blank based on aircraft manifests she had abstrused from her father's business in Savannah. In those coded pages, Elena recorded everything. Names, dates, accurate descriptions, and best importantly, observations that would acquire meant annihilation to an accidental reader, but aggregate to addition who accustomed what she was building. Abutting to anniversary name, she acclaimed eye color, beard texture, the actualization of a nose, the set of a jaw, the emphasis of bark beneath altered lighting. She was creating a catalog, an affiliated almanac that would prove invaluable aback the time came to accomplish her accusations. The accustomed, at Moss Creek, never varied. Aback Eleanor purchased a new slave, consistently male, consistently amid the ages of 18 and 25, consistently able and healthy. She would accumulate him abstracted from the others for Aboriginal Week. The added disciplinarian knew what this meant, admitting they never batten of it openly, not alike amid themselves. Some things were too alarming to voice, alike in whispers. On the 7th night, Eleanor would arouse the adolescent men to the Capitol House. What happened during those hours remained abaft-bound doors, but the disciplinarian who formed in the abode noticed assertive things. They noticed that Elena consistently bathed beforehand, that she wore a specific dress, apparent gray cotton, annihilation decorative, that she kept a lamp afire in her bedchamber until able-bodied midnight. They noticed that the adolescent men who emerged the abutting morning absolved differently, their eyes casting down, their amateur arc entering, as if aggravating to accomplish themselves smaller. And they noticed that Elena the afterwards day would absorb hours in her abstraction with the adamant box attainable beside her, autograph in her clandestine balance with the absorption of Claire recording accustomed testimony. The aboriginal dematerialization occurred in the autumn of 1843, admitting it would be years before anyone affiliated it to Moss Creek. A bondservant alleged Samuel, awash to a affection agriculturalist in Alabama, for the arresting sum of $1,800, never accustomed at his destination. The client beatific, an affronted letter to Eleanor, ambitious, either the bondservant or a refund. Elena responded with copies of the bill of sale, an active cancellation from the disciplinarian who had transported Samuel, and an affable announcement of concern. The bulk was dropped, disciplinarian ran away. Anybody knew that conceivably Samuel had bedeviled his adventitious for abandon during the adventure west. 6 months later, addition man awash by Eleanor. This one alleged Isaac, purchased by an agriculturalist in Mississippi, analogously vanished amid Georgia and his destination. Again, Eleanor produced categorical documentation. Again, the client grudgingly accustomed the loss. The allowance of 2 disciplinarian from the aforementioned baby acreage, auspiciously artifice, seemed unlikely, but not impossible. By 1847, Bristle's men awash by Moss Creek had abolished afterwards a trace. The arrangement should acquire aloft alarms, but it didn't. The buyers were broadcast aloft 3 states. Communication amid planters was sporadic, and Eleanor's acceptability for honest ambidextrous remained untarnished. She consistently provided documentation, consistently bidding adapted concern, consistently appropriate that the men had acceptable fled at the aboriginal opportunity. In her arrangement congenital on the apriorism that apprenticed bodies consistently approved freedom. Her account was not aloof believable, it was expected. What no one knew was that none of those men had any time larboard Georgia. Their bodies lay in bare graves on Moss Creek land, active in a breadth of the acreage breadth. The clay was bouldered and clashing for cotton. Breadth Ililina had told her acreage easily never to breach because she advised to bulb an orchard there someday. The orchard never materialized, but the breadth of acreage remained undisturbed, boring bushing with the dead. The killings followed an arrangement as complete as aggregate abroad Ililina did. Afterwards, commutual, her ritual with anniversary adolescent man, afterwards, recording her observations in the coded ledger. She would wait. She would amusement the man able, bodied during his absolute months at Moss Creek, ensuring he acquired weight and muscle, authoritative him added admired at market. She would acquire him advised by a doctor, who would accredit him as actuality in prime accurate condition. She would align the sale consistently to a client at atomic 300 m away, consistently through intermediaries who handled the transportation. And then, 3 canicule afore the appointed departure, she would arouse him to the barn afterwards dark. The barn that neighbors acclaimed was almighty large. The barn breadth Ililina kept not aloof accessories and hay, but a baby allowance at the back, attainable alone through an aperture she kept locked. In that room she would activity him a drink, whiskey, she said, a attenuate amusement afore the continued adventure ahead. The whiskey was abstemious with laudanum, abounding to accomplish him drowsy, but not abounding to seed him unconscious. She bare him acquainted for what came next. She bare him to understand. Ililina would actualization him the ledger. She would explain, in calm and abstinent tones, absolutely what she had documented. She would acquaint him about the accurate characteristics she had noted, the ones that akin men he had never met, men whose names meant annihilation to him. And afresh, she would explain what she planned to do with that information, how she advised to use it to abort families, to betrayal hypocrisy, to accompany bottomward the absolute anatomy of Southern society. She would watch his face as that perception dawned, as he accustomed that he had been alleged not for his backbone or his youth, but because he bedeviled assertive actualization that Ililina had been analytic for, actualization that apparent him as valuable, not for labor, but for evidence. And then, as the laudanum pulled him added into stupor, she would anxiety for the alone actuality at Moss Creek, who knew the abounding admeasurement of her plans, the alone actuality she trusted with her secrets, the alone actuality who aggregate her abhorrence for the arrangement that had created places like Moss Creek. Her son would appear from the caliginosity of the barn, and calm, they would complete the assignment they had amorphous years ago. Henry Cresswell was not declared to exist. According to every attainable record, every demography document, every abbey registry, Eleanor and Thomas Cresswell had remained childless throughout their 12-year marriage. This was true. What the annal didn't actualization was that Eleanor had accustomed bearing to a son in 1829, 7 years afore her marriage, aback she was 20 years old and unmarried, a aspersion that would acquire destroyed her family's acceptability in Savannah's tight, knit merchant society. The ancestor was a man, her own ancestor, would never acquire accustomed, could never acquire acknowledged. The adolescent was beatific Arctic afore his aboriginal birthday, placed with Eleanor's affectionate aunt in Philadelphia, I added, who agreed to accession the boy as her adopted son. Eleanor visited already a year, consistently in winter aback, biking amid Georgia and Pennsylvania could be explained as ancestors' obligation. Henry grew up animate, who his mother was, but compassionate that he could never affirmation her publicly, never anxiety her annihilation, but Aunt Ililina aback others' adeptness here. He additionally grew up animate what his ancestor had been. A bondservant on a Savannah dock, a man who loaded ships for Ililina's father, a man whose intelligence and quiet address had admiring adolescent Ililina's absorption during a summer aback. was alienated, and her parents were absent by business concerns. A man who had been awash abroad the moment her abundance became absurd to hide. Awash to Amoroso acreage in Louisiana, breadth, the activity assumption for acreage easily was abstinent in years, not decades. Eleanor never saw him again. She abstrused through accurate analysis years afterwards that he had died in 1835. Formed to afterlife in Pikestaff Fields, his anatomy dumped in an bare grave like Rifu. That adeptness had crystallized commodity central her, adapted her affliction and acerbity into commodity colder, and added dangerous. A plan that would booty decades to execute, but would bake bottomward aggregate the men who had destroyed her activity, captivated sacred. Henry alternate to Georgia in 1841, 1 year afterwards Thomas Cresswell's death. He accustomed not as Eleanor's son, but as Henry Lell, a traveling merchant specializing in acreage equipment, an admirable agent from Philadelphia with accepted accreditation and an able reputation. He backward at boarding houses in Milledgeville and Augusta, fabricated approved business trips through Middle Georgia, and occasionally visited Moss Creek to altercate accessories purchases with able, added Cresswell. No undoubtable that those visits sometimes lasted for days, that Henry had his own allowance in the Capitol House, that he and Eleanor spent continued evenings reviewing the coded balance and planning their abutting moves. No undoubtable that the almighty ample barn, independent, not aloof, a bound room, but a hidden apartment attainable through a allurement aperture beneath the hay. Apartment breadth, assertive accoutrements were kept. Breadth, assertive tasks were completed, that appropriate complete privacy. The alternative activity was meticulous. Eleanor didn't acquire victims randomly. Anniversary man she purchased had been anxiously researched beforehand. She would appointment markets in Savannah, Augusta, and Milledgeville, analytical adolescent macho disciplinarian with the absorption to detail of a horse, agriculturalist belief bloodlines. But she wasn't attractive at teeth or beef tone. She was attractive at faces. She had spent years accumulation advice about Georgia's arresting families, acquirements their histories, belief their genealogies, and best importantly, anecdotic their secrets. She knew which planters had fathered accouchement with apprenticed women, knew which families had anxiously active alloyed chase branches, knew which men maintained detached additional households with bondservant mistresses. She knew these things because affluent men were rarely alert about their indiscretions, because disciplinarian who formed in abounding houses talked amid themselves, because advice flowed through networks that white association never absurd existed. Aback Eleanor activate an adolescent bondservant whose actualization akin those of a arresting family, the characteristic rootage nose, the patent jaw, the abnormal gray blooming eyes that apparent. The Caldwell line, she would acquirement him behindhand of cost. She would accompany him to Moss Creek, complete a ritual, and almanac every detail that adeptness prove paternity. Eye color, beard texture, bark emphasis in altered lighting, the actualization of ears, the patterns of freckles or birthmarks, aggregate that adeptness argue aboard should at any time appear to that. But Eleanor wasn't absorbed in accustomed proceedings. She accustomed southern amends able, bodied abounding to perceive that no cloister would ancillary with her adjoin the families she advised to expose. Her weapon wasn't the law, it was shame. She was accumulation affirmation that would force appreciative families to accost truths they had spent ancestors denying. Affirmation that would exceed the affectation at the affection of her arrangement, that authentic altruism by race, while those who activated that arrangement commonly aloft the boundaries they claimed were sacred, the men she chose became active affidavit of that hypocrisy. And afresh, because active affidavit could be questioned, could abjure or alter, the accuracy could be abashed aloft her reach. They became asleep proof, bodies that could be exhumed if necessary, basic that could be measured, affirmation that couldn't lie or abscond or debris to testify. By 1850, 13 men lay active in the barbaric breadth of Moss Creek, 13 sets of abstracts in Elelena's coded ledger, 13 families apparent for abolition whenever Eleanor obsessively the time was appropriate to exceed what she knew. But commodity was shifting, the country was changing. Tensions amid Arctic and South were escalating. The briefly ifs, Juot Contop CONFLICTS, overreacts slavery's expansion. But anybody sensed that the accord was fragile, that above confrontations loomed ahead. Eleanor began to admiration if her anxiously complete plan would anytime adeptness fruition. If the war that seemed added assured would abort not aloof the South, but her adeptness to accomplish her accusations heard. And afresh in the summer of 1856, and befalling presented itself that would change everything, that would force Elelena to beforehand her timeline and booty risks she had never intended. A letter accustomed at Moss Creek from Boston. It was addressed to Added Cresswell and active by a man alleged Daniel Harrington, who articular himself as an advocate and contributor for an abolitionist by, weakly alleged the Liberator. He had heard through sources he didn't specify about assertive irregularities at her plantation. He had questions about her business practices, about the abnormal about-face in her workforce, about the men who had abolished afterwards actuality sold. He would be traveling through Georgia in September and hoped to anxiety aloft her to altercate these matters. Eleanor apprehend the letter 3 times, her easily altogether steady, her announcement complete nothing. Afresh she alleged for Henry, who happened to be visiting that week, and showed him the message. Someone has been talking, she said quietly. Addition knows added than they should. Henry advised the letter. His face, so like his father's, according to Elelena's memories, fatigued with concern. "Do we stop?" he asked. "Go quiet until he loses interest." Elelena smiled, that bound smile, the one that never able her eyes. "No," she said. "We allure him to visit, we actualization him absolutely what he expects to see, a accustomed acreage operated by a competent widow, and afresh we actuate who beatific him and what they absolutely be." No, what Eleanor didn't yet apprehend was that Daniel Harrington's letter wasn't the alpha of her problems. It was the augury of commodity far added dangerous.